Hello everyone! Thank you for tuning in to the Wasabi Aquarium channel. Today's video should be helpful for any beginners who have just started building their layout, anyone who is contemplating on implementing CO2s to their aquarium, or anyone who is thinking that the implementation of CO2 is very difficult. It is a common notion that the most difficult step for beginners when building out their aquarium is setting up their CO2s. Of course, we often receive a lot of questions regarding this matter from our customers as well as our listeners, including how to both set up and attach CO2 to your aquarium. Today, we will actually demonstrate this visually by actually building out a CO2 system and attaching it to our aquarium. So this video alone should solve many of your issues you may have experienced regarding CO2. And in today's video, we will be using a CO2 system called Advanced System Forest by ADA. Although we will be only using this setup by ADA in this video, the regulators and other parts that appear in this video is the same for all other CO2 setups by different companies, and the rules and procedures that I'll be going through will apply exactly the same for all other CO2 systems, so anyone would be able to use this video as a reference. First, let's take a look at a fully set up and fully attached CO2 system. This should give you an idea of how the finished build out is supposed to look like. Then, let's go through the individual parts of the CO2 system. First, this is the CO2 cylinder or cartridge. This is a high pressure, miniature sized cartridge. Then, this is the regulator, which converts the pressure of the CO2 to a more usable pressure, and this also connects directly to the gas. Then the ball valve or the solenoid allows you to manually control the supply of CO2 and lets you turn it on and off. Next is an electronic fully automated solenoid with a timer that allows you to control the entrance of CO2 inside your aquarium fully automatically and will shut off the CO2 at the time you require. Then, if you want more specific or more detailed levels of control in the amount of CO2 into your aquarium, these are called speed controllers, which will allow you to do so. This tool is actually not 100% necessary, and you can also adjust the amount of CO2 that goes into your aquarium by twisting this metal screw right here, so you can decide whether to use a speed controller or not depending on how specific you want to be with the amount of CO2 into your aquarium. Next is this part right here, which we call the check valve. This specific tool prevents water from flowing backwards towards your CO2. If this part here is not working or is missing from your setup, water can flow backwards while the CO2 is turned off, and worse comes to worse, the water can damage your electric timers and regulators, so the check valve is absolutely essential and necessary. Next is the CO2 counter, which allows you to visually monitor the rate of CO2 entering your aquarium. Next is the diffuser. A diffuser allows an effective method for CO2 to enter the aquarium. The CO2 is pushed through a porous medium that breaks down the gas into a fine mist of bubbles. These bubbles are then more easily absorbed by your aquarium water. Next, let's touch upon the tubes that connect the entire setup to make the CO2 function properly. CO2 actually requires two types of tubes. One is translucent and soft, while the other is hard and is pressure resistant depending on which equipment you're connecting. A simple guideline to keep in mind if you do not know which tube to implement is that all glass equipment must be connected with soft tubes. For example, over here, the glass tip is connected to a soft tube, and this counter is also made of glass, so we've used a soft tube. On the other hand, everything else from the drop checker, stop valve, solenoid, bubble counter, timer, and speed controller should be connected with hard, pressure-resistant tubes. One note to keep in mind is that the transition from hard tubes to soft tubes happens at the check valve. The in end of the check valve where the CO2 should be connected with the hard tube, and the other end should be connected to the glass equipment with a soft tube like how we have done over here. If you misplace the tubes or have the wrong tube on the wrong ends, this can lead to CO2 leaking or your glass equipment breaking when forcing your tubes on. So it's very important to remember which tube goes on which end of your check valve. So this was the overall flow of connecting the various essential parts that make up your CO2 system. Now let's move on to actually building out the CO2 system. Let's start with the tubes, which the length of your tubes will most likely change depending on your setup or where you're going to be placing your CO2 from your aquarium. But either way, you'll be cutting your tubes to the right length according to the factors that I just mentioned. One important point to keep in mind is when you cut the tubes, make sure to cut with a sharp pair of scissors and try to cut as perfectly straight as possible. If your tubes have rigged edges, there's a high chance of CO2 leaking, so I would be extra careful with this procedure. At our store, we use these tube cutters, which allow you to cut your tube perfectly straight. If you don't have something like this at your house, it is important to use a pair of scissors with very sharp edges, as rigged cutting edges can cause a high chance of CO2 leaking. I will leave links to tube cutters available online in the description below, so if you're interested, please check it out when you have the chance. Now moving on to the regulator, it's very important to keep this lever closed for the time being, as leaving it open will allow your CO2 to leak freely. And then you're going to attach one end of the tube that you just cut, and if you insert the tube beyond the ring here, it automatically locks and you won't be able to pull the tube off. If you need to take the tube off, you push down the ring here as you pull, and then push it back in without touching the ring, and the tube will lock back onto the regulator once again. Pretty easy and straightforward, right? Next, we're going to attach the stop valve or solenoid. It's extremely important to make sure the lever here is closed and no gas is flowing through. Once you've checked that, you attach the other end of the tube that's connected to the regulator to the stop valve. There aren't any locks on this one, so you just squeeze right in. Now this allows you to completely shut off the gas, so you can move on to the next step of attaching your CO2 cartridge or cylinder like this. You must make sure your CO2 cartridge is standing up when attaching the regulator, or else your regulator could break. So make sure it's standing straight and squeeze through as it's set up like a screw. You might hear a sound of gas flowing out midway, but don't worry and make sure to squeeze until the very end. It actually takes a bit of strength, and for ladies, please apply as much pressure as possible until you feel the click and the regulator is completely attached to the CO2 cartridge. If you somehow stop before it is fully attached, your CO2 will 100% leak, and you'll find that your CO2 cartridge is completely empty even though you just changed it. So make sure to apply a lot of pressure while the CO2 cartridge is standing straight until the two are fully attached and connected. Next, we're going to apply the hard tube over here and squeeze hard this time also. And then the other end of this tube goes into the automated solenoid. We're currently using a tool called the L valve by ADA, which actually indicates which end is in and which end is out over here above each end. Although it may be a bit hard to see on camera, in is for the CO2 and out is for the aquarium, so we're going to attach this tube on the in end. and then this one on the out end. So here we are with both ends connected like this. Next, if you're going to use a speed controller, we implement it here. Speed controllers also have a correct direction. For example, this ADA speed controller does too, but it's extremely difficult to tell which the in end is and which the out end is. The only way for me to be sure is to look at the description manual that comes with the product. As mentioned earlier, getting the direction or the ends wrong can lead to your gas to leak, so I would make sure to be 100% sure when attaching these tools. Above the ADA logo over here, you'll see the indicators in tiny letters, which is in and which is out. So we're gonna attach the in end to the L valve. So now we're attaching the hard tube to the out end, and the rest is actually very easy after this. It's actually super simple from here, so I'm not gonna go into too much depth, but the in end of the check valve, which has a triangular shape, so we're gonna take the fat end here and attach to the in end. And then we're gonna do the same thing with the out end, but with a soft tube. We're also going to make sure the ends of the soft tubes here are completely straight and sharp. Then finally, we're gonna connect the glass bubble counter to the diffuser. One thing to not forget is to insert the tube through the rubber, as you won't be able to go back once you've connected everything. Next, the bubble counters actually require you to insert water inside them, which is actually pretty simple as well. You just have to place the counter inside your aquarium and the water will start flowing in. From there you can directly connect it to the check valve, so there will be no issues of water leaking anywhere. The CO2 diffusers with counters installed also just need to be placed inside the aquarium for it to be filled with water, so you just need to follow the exact same steps. Finally, I will follow up with 2 detailed points that I've received a lot of questions about. First, I often get a lot of comments that it is very difficult to insert the soft tubes onto the glass equipment. The best way to solve this is to place either one inside the water for a bit, and that just smoothen the process and make it easier to attach. Also, if you're having a hard time detaching the tube from any glass equipment, do not try to force it off by pulling hard, but just cut the tube so that it comes off. Trying to pull a dry tube off of glass equipment forcefully can potentially break the glass, which is a huge loss in terms of monetary value, while one piece of tube can easily be replaced. So make sure to just cut the tube off if you face any trouble like this. The second question I receive a lot is regarding the metal screws. As you can see here, the 2 screws, one big and one small, the correct positioning is the big one should be attached to the smaller one. If they're placed on opposite ends, the adjusting lever will not be able to move, which could be safe if you have small children or pets around your aquarium, but it would be best to keep the screws positioned like this so that you can easily adjust them anytime depending on the situation. This position keeps it at stop, and then the small screw still moves around, so you can adjust this however you like and vice versa. I did receive a lot of questions on this with comments on their screws not moving properly, so I took some time to explain the correct way of implementing the screws. This is most definitely also written in your manual or the instruction description, so please check any documents you have just in case as well. So today, we went through the procedures on setting up your CO2 system for your aquarium. Of course, every product or equipment comes with a set of instructions on paper, but a lot of the times, the actual procedures are much more complicated and these manuals just are not enough. I think we were able to go through all of the steps in setting up your CO2 in a visual explanation, and I hope this makes your day a lot easier. Please also make sure to cross-check with the actual written instructions though, as specifics may vary depending on the product. These procedures may seem complicated or difficult at first, and you may be scared to implement gas into your aquarium for the first time. But you will for sure get used to it, and constantly pumping CO2 into your aquarium will dramatically make your plants healthier, and you will 100% see the difference between aquariums with and without CO2. So I would strongly recommend practicing these procedures for an even better environment inside your aquarium. I will also leave links to various CO2 systems in the description below, so please check them out and find one that works best for you. Especially if you have CO2 with timed solenoids, your CO2 system will be completely automated, where your CO2 will be turned on and off at a specific time without you having to do anything except for changing the CO2 cartridge from time to time. All you need to do is get the setup procedures we went through in this video right, and you literally won't have to touch it again for a long time. Overall, the two steps that beginners find difficult are CO2 that we discussed today and external filters. I've also created videos in the past where I go through the setup procedures of external filters in detail like we did today for CO2. So if you're having any trouble, make sure to check that video out from the description below. If you have any additional questions or comments regarding any of the content that we discussed today, please feel free to write them in the comment section below. Although we may not be able to answer each question individually, we will create additional content based on the popular questions we receive. If you found today's video helpful, please leave a comment, like, and make sure to subscribe to the Wasabi Aquarium channel. We will continue to create helpful content for aquarium lovers, so your continuous support would be very much appreciated. That's it for today. Thank you.